Hello everyone, I'm Command Sergeant Major Retired Troy Welch, and welcome to this edition of Soldier Today podcast. Our newest discussion topic, especially for non-commissioned officers and leaders, is standards and discipline. For our discussion today, we will explore the importance of standards and discipline in a unit, the relationship between the two, and the impact on the unit when one or both are absent. Then we will dive into the why discussion so we can understand why standards are important and the challenges leaders face developing disciplined organizations. So this is a great subject to discuss, and the best person to have the discussion with here in our studio is the Sergeant Major of the Army Retired, Kenneth Preston. SMA, welcome to Soldier Today podcast.
Hey, Sergeant Major, thanks very much, and glad to be here with you again.
Cool. SMA, you've been an advocate for standards and growing disciplined organizations for many years. Have seen and served with soldiers in many different units in battle and in peacetime. So for our listeners, I would like to start with the why question. Why are standards and discipline so important?
Sergeant Major, as you look at our institution, I mean, we are a standards-based Army. And it goes all the way back to our humble beginnings as a Continental Army when Baron von Steuben, who's credited for being one of the forefathers of our Continental Army and teaching us the essentials for military drills and tactics and disciplines in the form of regulations. You know, he brought our newly established Army what we call the Blue Book, the regulations and the order of discipline of the troops of the United States. He served as our first Inspector General and as a Major General in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. So he's the one that brought this ragtag group of farmers and hunters and businessmen together and kind of molded them into the premier fighting force that liberated our nation and started us on the journey we continue to this day. So standards develops discipline, and together they form cohesive and functional teams. And that's the piece that, really, why do we have standards? And it's really about standards builds disciplined organizations.
Ooh. Speaking of those two words, standards and discipline, let's get into the definition of those two. So let's start off with, what are standards?
Sure. So in the Army, we have lots of different standards. And I used to, when I get into this subject, kind of ask for a show of hands. Okay, so what are standards? And I would get things like, well, they're an expectation, or they're the minimum requirement. They're accepted level of proficiency, or they're a policy or a regulation or an SOP, a standard operating procedure. So if you look at standards out there, they are all part of the three-step process in how we develop leaders. So the first step in growing leaders is to establish a standard. So in the Army, if you think about it, we've got standards that are established at the Department of the Army level. So Army Regulation, as an example, Army Regulation 670-1. Wear and appearance of the Army uniform, which actually, by the Blue Book, that was one of the things that Baron von Steuben wrote in there was the standards for how you wear your uniform. This is so that the sergeants could inspect the troops. So, that Army regulation defines, where we wear our name tag, where we put all the accoutrements on our uniforms. It also covers grooming standards, hair length, nail polish. So all of that's in there so that the Army, whether it's the regular Army, the Army National Guard, the Army Reserve, we all wear our uniform, our grooming standards are the same. But one of the things that regulation does not cover is it doesn't tell us where to put the MOLLE pouches on our outer tactical vest if we're the infantry battalion down the road, or where to put those MOLLE pouches if we're the engineer unit, the combat engineers. So all of those things, cat eyes on the helmet band, those things are all usually established down at the unit level by a unit SOP, a set of standard operating procedures. And if you think about it, we establish lots of standards in the Army. When we go down and we do preventive maintenance checks and services, on our vehicles in the motor pool, or even a crew serve weapon or a rifle or an MKT, a mobile kitchen trailer, So when you're out there and you're doing PMCS, we've always been taught to, you pull out the -10, the operator's manual, and then you go step by step, and you do those preventive maintenance checks and services. That's an expectation. You think about other standards that we have established. We teach loading and clearing immediate action procedures for every weapon in our inventory. So whether it's, it's a a 9mm pistol, it's a rifle, it's a caliber 50 machine gun, or it's an Abrams tank. They all have immediate action procedures.
Right.
They have loading and clearing procedures. So, if you're coming off of a range, you clear your weapon. There's a step-by-step process to clear that weapon. That's an established standard. And of course, across all 150 different career fields, we have lots of different procedures and standards that we've established within those career fields. Even if you look at our barracks, as a brand new battalion command sergeant major, the first time I walked through the barracks, 9 o'clock in the morning, and the soldiers had already done cleanup in their rooms and the common areas were done. And, you get down the hallway and there's the proverbial mop closet about halfway down, and you open the door, and of course all the brooms and the mops and everything fall out, and you kind of jump back, and the first thing the first sergeant says is, "Sergeant Major, that's not our standard." And that's exactly right. That's not your standard. And even the mop closet in the barracks has a standard at 9 o'clock in the morning. So in the Army, for growing and developing leaders, if you think about it, step number one is establish a standard. So we've got lots of standards out there. Step number two is to put somebody in charge of it. And that's where first line supervisor comes in. That's where the corporal or the sergeant who's responsible for his or her 3 or 4 soldiers, they are empowered to enforce all standards. And whether it's a Department of the Army regulation or a unit SOP, they're responsible for enforcing all those standards for that piece of the Army that they're responsible for. And of course, step number 3 now is where all of us who are more senior, step number 3 is to hold the sergeant accountable. And this becomes important, particularly when, Private Preston out there is not looking the way he's supposed to, or not performing the way he's supposed to. It's the Sergeant Smith, Sergeant Jones now that's held accountable, for Preston's performance. Right. So that is standards, and that's, my view of standards in the Army and why we have standards.
Yeah, no, that was great. So let's just jump right into the same question. What is discipline?
Yeah, so discipline is behavior that's tempered by high standards of conduct and performance. If you think about it from an individual's perspective, each of us as an individual soldier, it is the ability to control one's own behavior, willingly to do what is right in the absence of a supervisor or orders. So I use a classic example, you're out there by yourself. Say you're walking across the parking lot. I used to have these discussions as a brand new battalion sergeant major or as a first sergeant. And, soldiers walking across the parking lot, and there's the proverbial soda can laying there in the parking lot. And they walk right past it.
He kicks it.
Or kicks it, yeah. Yeah, that's really bad. It's one thing to ignore it, but instead of picking it up. But again, it goes back to, what is the established standard, and then what's the discipline of the individual to do the right thing when there's leadership is not around. Right. So that's the first piece of that, and discipline also reflects our commitment to policies, procedures, and processes that are consistent with the Army ethic. Do we teach soldiers how to think, or do we teach soldiers what to think? Right. And this is a real deep discussion too. And I would say it depends on at what point or where they are in their career and what they already know. If you're bringing in brand new recruits, at that point in a soldier's career, you got to teach them, what to think. You got to teach them what they are supposed to be, know, and do. Yeah. And then as they kind of master those techniques, then you can get into teaching them how to think. And this really then gets into where we want to go in the Army with mission command, so that when you've got small little teams and squads and platoons out there operating, independently on their own. As a first sergeant in a cavalry regiment of a cavalry troop, I had 2 scout platoons, 12 Bradleys, and we were covering down on 15 kilometers of a screen line. And when you've got that one lone Bradley out there with a young sergeant or staff sergeant Bradley commander, who's responsible not only for the vehicle but the crew and the eagles in the back, it's being able to do the right thing, to have the discipline to follow the right set of orders, the focus on the mission command and the commander's intent, really 2 levels up, right, for the command that you're in.
It's interesting. You talk about, telling them how to think. I remember when I was a private coming in the Army, you're right. I mean, I had to be told, this is how you blouse your boots. This is where you wear your belt buckle in relationship to your buttons on your blouse. I mean, it was very good examples. And I especially like the piece about, doing what is right even when nobody's watching. I used to try to instill that to my young soldiers.
Yeah,
I had the pleasure of leading.
Exactly. And just like, all the things like how you wear your uniform. I mean, once you master those fundamentals, then, you kind of take the training wheels off and, you kind of move up into positions of increased responsibility. Right. Yeah. And there's an expectation there from leaders to do the right thing.
And you continue to grow. So in keeping with that, how important is that leader presence to establishing standards and developing discipline in organizations? Really
what it comes down to is leading by example. And, if you look at, the 7 principles of leadership today, leading by example for me, as it was in the past as a young sergeant, today is still very much the truth because it's, in my mind, all-encompassing. Because if you are leading by example, you're doing all the right things in all those other areas as well. And, it's your demonstrated process, how you carry yourself, how you talk to your soldiers. All those things are to lead by example. And you want, the soldiers that are following you to emulate what you do.
So that was great discussion on leading by example. May standards be adapted based on the environment? And if so, how? And what, if any, impact does this have on discipline and leadership? I mean, I'm looking for some examples.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. So for non-commissioned officers, we don't make the standards. We enforce the standard. And I used to love these discussions with the commanders, with the pre-command course, new battalion brigade commanders, new battalion sergeant majors. When you get down there into your unit as a brand new battalion command sergeant major, you're not going to go out and start establishing policies and procedures. It's the commander that establishes those, and it's the non-commissioned officers then that enforce them. This goes all the way back to our humble beginnings, as a Continental Army when Baron von Steuben wrote the Blue Book. And it really defined and delineated the roles and responsibilities of officers and non-commissioned officers. So non-commissioned officers enforce the standards. And as an example, seat belts is a great example. Safety regulation says that everybody will wear a seat belt, not only in your military vehicle, but also in your privately owned vehicle. You'll get, like in a combat situation, you're out there in a vehicle and someone says, well, I've got to be able to get out of my vehicle quickly. As a non-commissioned officer, we enforce the standard, put your seat belt on, you wear your seat belt. Now, if the circumstances change where,
right,
under certain circumstances, a commander does the risk assessment, and then based on the threat, based on the safety that's involved, they may make a decision that under certain circumstances that you don't wear your seatbelt. So those kind of things, a commander can take into consideration and make those adjustments as needed. But they also have to understand, what is policy, why it's in place, and then, make the adjustments appropriately. Another example is gas pumps. On post, if you look at the gas pumps, there's directional arrows all going the same direction, pointing into the gas pumps. Sometimes, you'll get somebody that'll kind of go to pull in, they're in line waiting to get gas. And of course, the gas pump nozzle's on the wrong side of their vehicle, so they'll turn around and they'll come from the opposite direction. And so, you make the on-the-spot correction. So, hey, look, these arrows are put on here because it's a confined area, and should something bad happen, something catastrophic, you got to be able to let all the vehicles out of here quickly. So that was the reason why AFIS had established that policy where all the vehicles were facing the same way. It was done on post.
Right.
And so you get into these discussions about, I don't make the policy, I just enforce it. Those are there for a reason. And I think that's why it's important out there that, we know and understand, what the standards are. We know why they're in place. It's the non-commissioned officer, that first line leader, and the soldiers then that make recommendations to make a change.
Okay, so thanks for that. Do you have any specific examples?
Sure, and this is as an example. You're talking about when leaders make decisions to do things. So I was a brigade sergeant major at Fort Hood, Texas, and I was filling in as the division rear command sergeant major while the headquarters was deployed. And I received a phone call early one morning from the division rear commander, and he said, "Hey, sergeant major, we had a soldier killed tonight on the range. I'm going out there first thing in the morning. I'd like for you to go out as well." And I said, "Roger that." And so I immediately called my brigade commander, and the following morning I met, the assistant division commander, and we drove out to the range. And when we got there, we were met by the company leadership. So you had company commander, you had 2 platoon leaders, you had 2 platoon sergeants, and they came forward and they reported to the commander, to the general, and began to go through the series of incidents that took place the night before that resulted in a soldier being killed. But one of the things that I noticed, and this is how not having enforced standards in a unit, how it can erode the discipline of an organization. And as I stood there and I looked at the commander and how he was wearing his uniform, he had a holster on. It was a 9mm holster that was kind of laced on with 550 cord. It was upside down, so it was kind of a quick draw kind of configuration. And the lieutenants were all different. The platoon sergeants were different. And it was at that time that I began to realize just the correlation between uniform standards and those enforcements and the discipline of the organization. And this goes back to the Continental Army and why Baron von Steuben established the Blue Book. And he was very specific in there about inspections and uniforms that non-commissioned officers and soldiers would wear. In this case, you had a captain who just arbitrarily decided to wear his uniform how he wanted to wear his uniform. And of course, the second, third, fourth order effects was that the platoon leaders decided they was going to wear their uniform the way they wanted. And the platoon sergeants did the same thing. And what they didn't realize is that what they did was they circumvented the authority of all the sergeants within that company, and that the sergeant at the lowest level now no longer felt empowered to make on-the-spot corrections and to put their soldiers, their piece of the Army, in the right uniform. And what I found also from that is that then it's a domino effect that flows after that. So, now you have at the lowest level sergeants, they stop making on-the-spot corrections. They stop inspecting weapons to ensure they're cleared as soldiers come off of a patrol coming onto a combat outpost. They stop enforcing soldiers to follow the operator's manual when they're doing preventive maintenance checks and services. And it just goes on and on and on. It just erodes the discipline of the organization. So, the things that I found that are most important, particularly in the field, and this goes back to the very principles of the Blue Book and why it was established, was that, we salute the officers, and we also were very strict on uniforms. And if you think about it, whether it's a PT formation in the morning or whether it's getting ready to go out on a combat patrol and you're doing pre-combat checks, you inspect your soldiers to ensure everything is where it's supposed to be and everything's groomed correctly in the morning for PT and all the rest of it. And that's the thing that builds the discipline by enforcing those standards within the organization.
So they were a little bit loosey-goosey. I used to say, find folks like that say, does the standard or does the policy, is it inconvenient?
Yeah.
Is it inconvenient? All right. So you can't follow ones that are just convenient for you. You got to follow them all. And it's unfortunate that unit did that and ended up costing somebody's life. So to what extent should a leader explain the underlying purpose for a standard?
My answer to that is as often as possible. And this comes back to, the direction that we're going right now with the Army. And really we're focused on mission command. As you look at our small formations out there, it's important that the lowest levels, the sergeant and his or her piece of the Army, know and understand what is the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish. And this way, when it comes down to making a decision, out there on the battlefield, and a lot of times these decisions have strategic level impacts, that they understand, what is the outcome of their mission, and what is the commander's intent that we're trying to accomplish.
So, Mr. Mayor, are there examples when a leader will not necessarily understand the reason behind a standard, yet still expect others to abide by it with discipline?
Yeah, well, I still believe that it's important for all leaders to understand some of the why behind policies and regulations. When the reasons why change, it becomes important for the leader to make recommendations to the command to change that standard. So, as you think about it, we put things in place and, months, years go by, and the conditions change, and the standards that are in place now are no longer relevant to what we're trying to accomplish. So it's important out there that we revisit that, and and that's why we have a chain of command and an NCO support chain, so that, it facilitates the flow of information, not only from higher down to lower, but just as important, to get recommendations and ideas from the lowest levels back up to the senior leadership.
So, you may recall a discussion you and I had several years ago when the conditions in 8th Army, soldiers walked. So we had a discussion about wearing a backpack over both shoulders versus one shoulder. So that was that's one of those examples where that standard raised to the higher levels, and we worked out a solution for the troops over there.
Yep, exactly right.
So how are standards and discipline related to who we are as Army professionals?
Well, we are the premier fighting force in the world, and when you look at how we are viewed by other armies all around the world, and the best example I can use is Eastern Europe, because I spent a lot of time in Europe, and I watched, from the time that the Iron Curtain fell, I watched Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, Estonia, Latvia. I mean, all those Eastern Bloc countries, how they evolved and changed, and really they wanted to replicate all that we had. And if you look at Poland today, they've got several NCO academies now across the country, to train their non-commissioned officer corps. So they've really kind of looked at how we grow and develop our junior leaders, and then you take over time, as you give them increased levels of responsibility, what is the training and the professional development they need to take on those additional responsibilities.
So I was doing a little research here, and I found this quote. This is General of the Armies, George Washington once said, "Discipline is the soul of an army. It makes small numbers formidable, procures success of the weak, and esteem to all." Do you think that this still applies today?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, it's all about focus. It's executing the drills and the skills that have been taught. In the midst of chaos, when the bullets are flying, the artillery is exploding all around you, and everything is just chaotic, it's discipline maintains focus, and it brings strength to the formation. And that's where, it's important that, we train as we fight. And I used to tell a lot of units that, we're in the process of training up and getting ready to deploy, that, if you don't teach and train standards, back in your formations as a peacetime army, once you deploy and you get into a forward theater, and whether it's deploying out there to Eastern Europe or into the Pacific or into the Middle East, it's too late, because at that point, then you're fragmented across the battlefield and you can't fix yourself. So it all starts with, how you train and how you grow your leaders back in home station.
Listen, man, this has been a great discussion on standards and discipline, and I think I can speak for all of our listeners out there, and we're very proud of our institution and all that the NCO leadership does to enforce those standards and discipline, which makes our Army, set apart from any other armies in the world. Thank you for your insights. It was a great discussion. To all our listeners, be sure to subscribe to Army Matters on Apple Podcasts and everywhere podcasts are found. Keep it locked for all Army Matters and for next week's episode with Army Real Talk. Thanks again, SMA. Army Strong.
Cool. Army Strong.